of philosophy, I asked myself, well, how would I organize what Russell says? So it's a good idea whenever you read something, ask yourself, how would I organize these ideas? What's the best way for me to organize these ideas so they may... So I came up with this way of organizing Russell's ideas. Maybe you will find this helpful. Knowledge for Russell includes knowledge of things up there and knowledge of truths. For Russell, knowledge of truths is in some way ultimately based on knowledge of things. So Russell thinks we have knowledge of things, and we have knowledge of truths, and somehow knowledge of things is the basis of our knowledge of truths. What would be a thing? A thing would be something like my cell phone, or this bottle of water. A truth would be something like this bottle of water is not full. Or I paid too much for this bottle of water. I should have bought it somewhere else. Or this cell phone was a gift. That's a truth. So we can then subdivide or break down into parts Russell's knowledge of things and his knowledge of truths. Let's start with knowledge of things. Now, as we know, Russell thinks that we have two kinds of knowledge of things. We have knowledge of things by acquaintance. We have knowledge of things by description. And of the things that we have, of which we have knowledge by acquaintance, some of these things are particulars, and some of them are universals. I'll explain that difference in a moment if it's not clear, but let's start with somebody give me a few examples of some things that Russell thinks we know by acquaintance. So what are some things, some particular kinds of things that Russell says we know of by acquaintance? What are some examples of some things that Russell says we know of by acquaintance? So what's something I'm acquainted with?
This.
Oh, so, yeah, you start that.
The color of the blackboard.
Very good, okay. Good. So I'm acquainted with the color of the blackboard. Excellent, thank you. Very good. I was just about to, I wrote down a bunch of names. I was about to say, okay, I'll just call something. But that's better if you volunteer. Better, thank you. So, right, so things like the color of the blackboard, or the sound of the bell that signals the beginning or the end of a section, or the smell of ragan miel, one of my new favorite foods. I never had ragan miel before I came to Wuhan. And so someone said, you should try it. And I said, oh, this is great. So I love that now. So smells too. The way something feels, the way ice feels, or the way a hot cup of soup or coffee or tea feels. In general, sense data. Sense data. This is a technical point, but just so you know, sense data is a plural word. It's plural. The singular of sense data is sense data. So singular. This is plural. But I'll be honest with you. Most U.S. college graduates do not know the difference between sense data and sense data. So if you get it wrong and you say sense data for the rest of your life, that's probably okay. There's just a handful of people like me who will know the difference. But I feel like I wouldn't be a good teacher if I didn't tell you the difference, even though you'll probably never need it. So sense data is plural because there's all kinds of sense data. But I could say the color of the blackboard is a sense data. But if you said the color of the blackboard is a sense data, it hurts me to say it because I know the difference. Sense data, most English speakers would just be amazed. They're like, wow, your vocabulary is really good. It's much better than mine, which they're right, it would be. So sense data, that's one thing we know of, we have particular knowledge of. And if I like it when people talk, but I will often encourage people who haven't talked yet to talk, because some people find it easier to talk than others. So somebody who hasn't taught this class or last class, tell me, what's another particular thing that Russell says we know by acquaintance? I'm acquainted with sense data like colors and smells and sounds and ways of both. What's something else that I'm acquainted with directly? I shouldn't hear you. Memory, thank you. Very good. Excellent. Very good. Memory, right. Memory. So right now, I'm remembering my hometown. I come from a small town in the western part of Pennsylvania. The last week, I was eating in a Muslim restaurant here in Wuhan. And I said, boy, this is strange. I'm a kid from a small town in western Pennsylvania, and I'm eating in a restaurant, a Muslim restaurant in Wuhan. I said, I came a long way. Most people in my hometown don't end up in China, so I'm happy I ended up here. So, but maybe it's a long way from your hometown to here as well. So I'm remembering my hometown now. That I'm acquainted with that memory. So, and Russell says that's not the same as sense data. I see the board right now. The memory is not I'm not remembering something I'm experiencing now. I'm remembering something. I haven't been to my hometown in about 30 years. Nobody lives out. So memory represents, I'm directly acquainted with. Give you one more, and then I'll give you the last one. I heard a bunch of somebody I had in the comments. Introspection. Good, very good. Right, so introspection. Very good, real good. Speaking up. So I can introspect. That means I can ask myself, what is it like to feel hungry? Or am I feeling hungry now? Or what is it like to look at the color red? Or what is it like when I'm listening to music? I can look inside myself and ask, what are those experiences like? So I can look inside. So Russell says, well, you're directly acquainted with sense data, you're directly acquainted with memory, and he says, although he's not sure, he says he thinks we're directly acquainted with ourselves. So we're directly acquainted with sense data, like the way things look, or they sound, or they smell, or they feel to touch, or they taste. We're directly acquainted with memories. We're directly acquainted with the contents of our own minds. I can ask, what is going on in my mind right now? And Russell says we're also, he thinks, acquainted with ourselves. Can anybody try to explain? Russell gives an argument for why he thinks we're acquainted with ourselves. I have a sense of what that argument was. So can somebody help me? What's Russell's argument for why he thinks we must be acquainted with ourselves? Interesting argument. I'm not sure it's right, but it's interesting. What's his argument? Okay, so expand Russell's argument a little bit. So he says we look inside of ourselves And what is it he thinks we see? You're right, it's not about bare cells, but what does he think we exist? About, there's a trick in the argument. That's the reason I'm pausing. You almost got the argument. So Russell says that suppose through introspection, so I'm looking at my own mental states, my own thoughts, introspection. When I look at my own thoughts, and I look at my own thoughts and I say, well, so now I'm looking at this bottle. So, when I'm looking at the bottle, but then what I can do is I can, through introspection, notice that I'm looking at the bottle.
Yes.
Yes. And so when I notice that I'm looking at the bottle, Russell says, well then, you must be aware of yourself, because yourself is the thing looking at the bottle. When I'm aware of seeing the bottle, say, if I ask you, because you can see the bottle too, you can try this and see, can you see the bottle? And you will say, well, yes, of course I can see the bottle. Now, introspect. Ask yourself, what is that experience like? Say, well, I'm introspecting and I'm experiencing myself seeing the bottle. Russell says, aha, that's yourself. So you must be acquainted with yourself. Why? Every proposition which we can understand must be composed wholly of constituents with which we are acquainted. That's a complicated sentence, but the basic idea is if we think of a statement, a proposition like, I see the bottle, what is it that I understand when I understand that I see the bottle? And Russell says, well, it's not just the bottle, it's that you see the bottle. Now, you're acquainted with the sense data of the bottle, that's fine. But if you see the bottle, you must also be acquainted with you. If Russell is right about this principle is right, it seems like, there has to be something that corresponds to the you. So, you're right, exactly. It can't just be a bare self that has no qualities. It can't be a pure self for Russell, or at least we can't experience ourselves as pure. He says we experience it when we experience something else. Or, I should be more exact, we experience something else and then we introspect and we see, I see, there's myself right there. Interesting argument. I'm not sure it's right, but that's interesting. Now, in addition to this, Russell says we're directly acquainted with universals. What are some examples of universals? I'm going to put quotation marks around them. That quotation marks might not be the way a philosopher would represent a universal. Usually quotation marks mean that you're either quoting a phrase or you're talking about a word. Like I could say something like, Bryan has 5 letters. That's my first name. That's true. I'm using quotation marks to indicate I'm talking about the word. If we take off the quotation marks, that would technically mean Bryan the person has 5 letters. I don't have any letters. That doesn't make any sense. What we really mean is Bryan the word has 5 letters. So maybe using quotation marks is not the best way to do this, because I'm actually not talking about the words. I'm talking about the universals. But an example of a universal would be the number 2. Not the word 2, but the number 2. Or the relationship taller than. or the property red? Because taller than is a phrase in English, and red is a word in English, and this is an Arabic numeral, a 2 is a word in English. But the universal 2 is not in English, and it's not in Chinese, and it's not in any language. It's this abstract entity. The relationship taller than is not in English or Chinese or Swahili or anything else. It's that relationship. Red, as a quality, a universal quality, is not in English or Chinese or anything else. So Russell says they're universals. Why does he believe there have to be universals? Every proposition which we can understand must be composed wholly of constituents with which we are acquainted. So, if we ask something like, I don't want to give away the next part of the lecture. What's a good way to phrase it? Ask, what does red refer to? Red doesn't refer to any particular red. It refers to all reds. Or triangle does not refer to any particular triangle. It refers to all triangles. These are universals. And Russell says, well, since we know universals like 2 or taller than or red, and since they're, in some sense, they're not things we know usually by description, we must be acquainted with them. So for Russell, we're acquainted with sense data, with memories, with the contents of our own minds, which we experience through interaction. We're directly acquainted with ourselves and most universals, like 2-ness or redness or taller than-ness, things like that. If you've read Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, Plato's notion of ideas or forms influenced Russell here. So if you know Plato, this shouldn't be too surprising. If you don't know Plato, well, that's where Russell's getting this idea. There must be these universal things that correspond to general terms. So that these are not particulars, they're general qualities. Now, in addition to things that we know by acquaintance, there are things we know by description. Somebody give me an example of something that we know by description. World. Sorry, I didn't hear you say it again.
The world.
The world. Yeah. Now why? Good. Now why is it we're not acquainted with the world? I mean, you're right. Russell will say we know it by description. But why don't I know it by acquaintance since I'm in the world? You're right. We don't know it by acquaintance according to Russell. Right. So we don't. The world is this big thing of which we're a part because we're not completely acquainted with it when we live in it. We can only know it by description. I've seen some parts of the world. I visited Beijing before, I visited Taipei, I visited New York, San Francisco. I was in Niagara Falls, Canada. I was in Japan for about 24 hours, changing planes, that's about it. So I've seen those parts of the world, right? But I'm not acquainted with the whole world. But you can know things by description if you can give a description of them based on things you are acquainted with. So, for example, I can know that there is I don't know who the current president of Wuhan University is. I should know that. I'm a guest here, I should know that. I'm sorry. I don't know, I never looked it up. So, but I know, and I've never met whoever the current president of Wuhan University is. I've never met him or her. But I can say, by description, I can refer to this thing, this person. I can say, the person who is the current president of Wuhan University. So that description will identify this person I've never been acquainted with. But Russell's idea is every description somehow can eventually be reduced to terms with which you are acquainted. So a term like president of Wuhan, you can replace that president of Wuhan University with a further description. And the terms of the description will ultimately get you to a particular individual. Let me give you an example. Here we go. This one will work. If I take the president of Wuhan, that's tricky because it's tricky to explain how that converts into a description with things we're acquainted with. But I think this works better. Marcus Aurelius Van Norden. That's the name of my dog. I don't know if people in China do that, but sometimes people in the U.S. give their dogs, they say it's, Fido. That's a common dog name. Fido Smith or Fido Jones. And so our dog, his first name and middle name are Marcus Aurelius, who was a famous Roman emperor and also philosopher. He's actually a pretty interesting philosopher. He's worth reading. But, so his name is Marcus Aurelius Van Norden. So you've never met, you're not acquainted with Marcus Aurelius Van Norden, even as a physical object. You've never been in his presence. So you can only know Marcus Aurelius Van Norden by description. So what's a description? The brown animal weighing more than 30 pounds in not very hard to see, Van Norden house. You know what brown is. It's a color. So you're acquainted with brown. Weighing more than 30 pounds, that's some kind of complex universal. Lots of things can weigh more than 30 pounds. The Van Norden house, that's a particular, which again you know by description, but we can imagine how to fill out that description. It's the structure's a universal in New York State that Van Norden lives in when he's not teaching at Wuhan. So the name is going to convert into this description. So Russell will say that anything basically whatever we do not know by acquaintance, you have knowledge of it, it's a thing, then we know it by description. And I know I asked you a question about this, but I kind of derailed the question a little bit. Russell says that we know other people's minds by description, and, well, I'll just say physical objects. So I broke these into 3 categories just because it's an easy way to think about it, but you could organize it a different way. But by description, Russell says basically everything we know that we're not directly acquainted with, we have to know it by description, if it's a thing. And that includes, for Russell, other minds. What does other minds mean? Russell says, I'm acquainted with my own mind through introspection. But you cannot be acquainted with my mind. Only know it, Russell says, by description. So, If I feel hungry, I just ate. But if I felt hungry, you'd say, well, I'm not acquainted with Van Norden's hunger, but I can give a description of it. You know, the feeling that Van Norden has, which is similar to the feeling I have when I want to eat something. Something like that would be a description you could give. But Russell will say you can never be acquainted with somebody else's mind. And even physical objects, so the sense data of this bottle, the way it appears, the way it smells, tastes, etc., that you're acquainted with. But the physical object itself, he says, you're not acquainted with. Why? He says, all you know is the way it appears to you. But what we believe about the bottle is what? We believe that in addition to the way the bottle appears to us, there is a bottle which is there even when we can't see it. So I brought this out of the machine. And I believe that this was sitting in that machine for at least a few hours, maybe days. And if I left this in my office, I would believe that it would stay in my office even after I left the office. When this bottle was in the machine, I couldn't see it. If I leave it in my office, I won't see it. But I believe it is a physical object that will continue to exist even when the sense data are not evident. But Russell says the physical object you can't be acquainted with. You can only be acquainted with the way it appears to you. All these ideas are very, very central. The specific way that Russell describes them, not all philosophers would agree with, but there's a whole philosophical tradition in the West going back to Descartes that's based on these ideas. There are philosophers in the West and in the United States who spend their entire career on issues like the problem of other minds. What is that? That's the problem of how do you have a good reason for believing there are other minds? Maybe I'm the only person who has actual thoughts and feelings, and you guys just act like you have thoughts and feelings. How would I know? I'm not acquainted with your mind. Now you're sitting there thinking, well, I know I have thoughts and feelings through introspection. Yeah, but then how do you know I have thoughts and feelings? Russell says, look, you know you have thoughts and feelings, but you don't know that Van Norden has thoughts and feelings. You don't know the person sitting next to you has thoughts and feelings because you're not acquainted with them. You're only acquainted with their bodies. And there are philosophers who spend their entire career trying to figure out, do you have a reason for believing in other minds? And Russell did not invent this problem, but he gives you a good discussion of why you might think it's a problem. And the basic idea is, Russell says you're acquainted with your own mind through introspection, but you cannot be acquainted with other people's minds. Then there's a question about whether you know other people have minds, which is weird, but it seems like, yeah, if Russell's right, that's a problem. So now, according to Russell, and I think you know this now, but let's just make it explicit. I've never met Deng Xiaoping. My lifetime overlaps with Deng Xiaoping's life, but I never met him. He actually seemed like a really interesting guy. I would have liked to have met him, but I didn't. But Russell says, every proposition which we can understand must be composed wholly of constituents with which we are acquainted. I can understand propositions about Deng Xiaoping. How can I understand propositions about Deng Xiaoping when I'm not directly acquainted with Deng Xiaoping? I think you know the answer to this. I kind of gave it away, but you phrase it for me. Especially if you haven't talked so far, this would be a great time to talk, because I kind of gave it away. If you want a hint, let me know. But I think you know now. Yes.
I know in my newspapers, TV, and some history.
Good. And how would Russell describe that in his terminology?
They just indirect ways, not direct ways.
Right. By, let's just use his words. By
Oh yes,
description. Yeah. You got it. You're exactly right. I just want to make you use Russell's phrase. Right. So just because we're trying to understand Russell, we might decide Russell's wrong, but right. So I know Deng Xiaoping by description. So I might know him as there's a famous saying in English attributed to Deng Xiaoping, and I don't know how to say it in Chinese or whether, I think it's accurate. I think I've heard a Chinese version of it. It's something like, it doesn't make any difference what color a cat is, as long as it catches mice. Yeah. So I might say, well, he's the one who's famous for saying that. He's probably not the first one to say it. But if I say, well, he's the Chinese leader most famous for saying that, then it's like, well, that's the description maybe in my head. Or, I think if I'm not mistaken, he's the next leader after Hua Guofeng. Is that right? Okay, so I think I got that one right. Okay, good. All right, so I can say that. So according to Russell, I can describe people. His example is Chancellor Bismarck, who was a major leader in Germany after, actually I don't even know when, I guess either before or after World War I, I don't even know. I know that when Russell wrote this book, people knew who Bismarck was. So that was a good example when he wrote the book. Now, I've heard of Bismarck, but most of you, have you heard of Bismarck? Yeah. Oh, you have? Oh, okay. History. Okay, well, good for you then. Most U.S. students haven't, but then most U.S. students are terrible at history. So Chinese students, in my experience, are usually better at history. But yeah, a lot of my U.S. students are like, who the heck is Bismarck? I don't see that. So Russell's example is, well, you know Bismarck by description, even if you've never met him. You know Deng Xiaoping by description. Here's something tricky. And I kind of gave this away too, but let's just make sure we understand it. Who is acquainted with Bismarck? Or let's do Deng Xiaoping. Who's acquainted with Deng Xiaoping? Good. Yeah, you're both right. Deng Xiaoping himself. Who else? No one, yeah. Reasonable answer to say, well, his family, surely. But for Russell, yourself is your mind. It's not your body. So Russell's going to say only Bismarck is actually acquainted with Bismarck. Even his wife, his kid, his best friend, none of them are acquainted with him. There's an old saying, I always thought this was a cool saying I heard when I was a kid. This is not so, it's kind of about Russell, but I'll just tell you this is a cool saying. Right? When I was a kid, I heard someone say, I think this was a U.S. judge, once said, everybody is three people. First person is who other people think you are. Second person is who you think you are. The third person is who you really are, which only God knows. If you don't believe in God, well then there's only two, and nobody knows you. But I thought that was a cool saying. So Russell would say, well, the only one who knows, who's really acquainted with you, is you. So other people, even Russell's wife, his son, or daughter, best friends, they only know him by description. Kind of surprising result. But again, if you're not acquainted with any mind except your own, you can see why you might say that. So we've got knowledge of things, and then we have knowledge of truth. Now, knowledge of truth, some of it, Russell says, is immediate or intuitive. He uses several words which seem to be approximately the same in meaning. Intuitive, self-evident, instinctive. These words don't have to be the same thing, but Russell uses them here in the same way. He probably, if you were being more careful, would distinguish them. But I think he said somewhere that he wrote this book in like 2 weeks. For some reason he needed to produce a book. I think he needed to make some money. And so he just sat down and wrote this book in 2 weeks. So it's a little, sometimes it's a little, he's not as careful. But so Russell says, well, there's immediate knowledge of truth. And he says that, sometimes says that those truths are intuitive, or they're self-evident, or they're instinctive. Now, what kind of truths do we have under this law? Some of them are truths of mathematics. Like, for example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, notice, Russell's going to say we're acquainted with the universal 2 plus 2 equals 4. Plus, addition is also universal. Equals is a universal. 4 is a universal. So we're acquainted with each of the parts of 2 plus 2 equals 4. But those are things. They're universal things, but they're things. The whole statement, 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's a truth. So one kind of general principle that is intuitive or self-evident or instinctive is mathematical truths. And what these things have in common is they cannot be doubted. They are, we might say, indubitable. Indubitable. That means cannot be doubted. Cannot be doubted. So Russell says you cannot doubt, you cannot question that 2 plus 2 equals 4. In general mathematical truths, you cannot question them, you cannot doubt them. You might not understand them, but if you understand them, you cannot doubt them once you understand them. So 2 plus 2 equals 4 is an example of a general principle in mathematics. Then there are also, exactly, logic, general truths in logic. And he mentions 3 of them. And he says they're often called laws of thought. That's not as common an expression anymore, but you still hear it sometimes. And he lists 3 rules of logic. He says there's the law of identity, the law of contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. So these fit under that number 2 there, logic. Now, after the break, we're going to talk about the law of identity, the law of contradiction, which is more often called now the law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. So let's take a break and we'll come back in 5 minutes when the Shoshi is shut. Yeah, if you haven't given it to me yet, you can put your homework up here if you'd like. 好，没问题。Yeah, so, okay, so let's continue with, we're talking now about Russell on knowledge of truths, and he says there are immediate truths, which he also describes as intuitive, self-evident, or instinctive. He means that they are indubitable, which is just a fancy way of saying they cannot be doubted. That's impossible to doubt. And among the indubitable truths, the truths that cannot be doubted are truths of mathematics, like 2 + 2 = 4, and truths of logic. Some of the truths of logic include what he calls the laws of thought, the law of identity, what he calls the law of contradiction. The law of contradiction is now more often called the law of non-contradiction, NON contradiction. but the basic idea is the same. And the law of the excluded middle. So the law of identity is just the law. We could express the law as X equals X. So everything is the same as itself. It's not a very surprising law, but it's just everything is the same as itself. I'm the same as myself, you're the same as yourself. The law of non-contradiction is a little harder, but not too hard, I think. Can somebody explain for me in what the law of non-contradiction is? Tell me what the law of non-contradiction is. What's the law of non-contradiction? The law of contradiction. So this is.
I can also possess a property and
Okay, good. So something cannot both have a characteristic or a property or a quality and not have that quality at the same time. Sometimes people add in the same sense at the same time. So let me write that up, because that's an important principle. Okay. So X, what is X? Could be anything. X cannot be both P. What is P? It's a property or a characteristic, or it could be being red, or it could be being taller than something else, or it could be being prime, like a prime number, or it could be even, like an even number. So the law of non-contradiction says X cannot be both P, that says have a certain property, and not P, not have that property, in the same sense and at the same time. What does that mean? When I was a little baby, I was very cute. I keep thinking of myself. So I was very cute. I'm not cute now. That is not a violation of the law of non-contradiction. Why? At the same time. When Van Norden was a baby, Van Norden was cute. Now that Van Norden is an adult, Van Norden is not cute anymore. That's okay, because the law of non-contradiction says Van Norden, the X, cannot be both P, cute, ka, and not P, in the same sense and at the same time. What about, that was a funny example, but let's pick a sad example. And I'm sorry it's a sad example, but it's the one I thought of before. I think of a non-sad example, really quickly. No, too late. So I'm sorry the example is sad. But let's imagine someone in a hospital, and suppose they had a very long life and a very happy life. They're 110 years old. They were very happy their whole life, had a wonderful family, wonderful career, everything went wonderfully. But now they're 110 years old. Actually, true story. Let me tell you a true story. At my wedding, there was a woman who was 100 years old. That's a true story. A month later, she fell sick, and she went to the hospital. And they said, well, it's bad, you have pneumonia. And she said, I've never been to the hospital before. What's wrong? And they said, sweetie, you're 100 years old. Yet we know you've been healthy your whole life, but you are 100 years old. That's what's wrong, you know. And she was, oh, okay. She wasn't sad. She understood, but she was just surprised because she'd never been sick a day in her life. But she realized, oh, I'm 100 years old, so now I'm going to be sick. This is it. So, but she was happy. That's what I'm stressing. So imagine a case where someone goes to the hospital and they're 120 years old. They die very happy, but their brain is dead, but their heart is beating. This happens sometimes. Your brain is dead, but your heart is beating. So we could say, oh, but doesn't that violate the law of non-contradiction? Because you're alive, P, because your heart is beating, but you're dead, not alive, not P, because your brain is not dead. Yeah, you're shaking your head, which is right? It doesn't violate the law of non-contradiction. Can you tell me why? Yes, excellent, good, you got it, that's good, excellent, you got it, you nailed it, right, exactly, in the same sense. So if somebody said, well, I don't believe in the law of non-contradiction because what if somebody's heart is beating but their brain is dead, they're alive and they're dead? Say, well, they're not alive and dead in the same sense of alive and dead. In the same sense of heart beating alive, they're alive. In the same sense of brain dead, they're dead. So the law of non-contradiction says, for anything you talk about, any X, it cannot both have a characteristic and not have a characteristic in the same sense at the same time. And Russell said, when you understand the law of non-contradiction, you realize, oh, I get it, if that's got to be true. The last law of thought is, excluded method, right? Excluded method. Let me write that down here. I'm going to erase Russell's quotations here so I have no room. For any X you pick, it's either going to be P for any property you pick, or it's going to be not P. So I am either over 50 years old, or I'm not over 50 years old. What if I'm exactly 50 years old? Well, then I'm not over 50 years old. So Russell, these are very common laws of logic. Russell calls them laws of thought. And Russell says these are examples of general principles which we immediately know are true as soon as we know them, we know they're true. Finally, he says that many claims of ethics are also general principles that are known to be true, like pleasure is good, or pleasure is better than pain. This is a point on which many modernists will disagree with Russell. Many modernists, people who are similar to Russell in other respects, will say that ethics is not intuitive or self-evident or instinctive. They'll say that ethics is not like logic. So some people will say, well, you know that 2 + 2 equals 4. You don't know that, say, murder is wrong in the same way. Some people agree with Russell here, but I'm just saying this claim is that ethics are immediate truths is less common than some of the other things Russell says. Now, in addition to immediate knowledge of general principles, he says we also have immediate, indubitable, intuitive, self-evident. Let me just write here. Cannot be doubted. There's also truths of perception. Like what? Truths of perception like this spot is green. This spot is green. Russell would say that's an immediate truth of perception. You perceive it, and in saying it's immediate, what he means is it's intuitive, it's self-evident, you cannot doubt it. As soon as you understand what I mean when I say this spot is green, you say, oh, yeah, you're right. I get it. You can't doubt it. So truths of perception, Russell says, are absolutely intuitive the same way. And finally, knowledge of memory. Now, we already mentioned memory under particulars we're acquainted with. But remember, for Russell, your knowledge of things is the basis of your knowledge of truths. So, I am acquainted with this green. Because I'm acquainted with this green, I know the truth, this spot is green. This spot is green is a statement. It can be true or false. In fact, it's true because this spot is green. The green spot is a thing. I'm acquainted with the green spot. Because I'm acquainted with the green spot, I know the truth, this spot is green. I'm acquainted with the memory of my hometown. Because I'm acquainted with the memory of my hometown, I know truths like my house had a red roof. My house had a red roof. I'm acquainted with the memory of my house I was raised in, so I know the truth, my house had a red roof. Now, Russell wants to tell us that our memories can't be images. Even though, he says, we usually have an image when we have a memory. So like now, I'm remembering my hometown. In fact, I'm remembering the house I was raised in. And when I remember the house I'm raised in, I have an image in my head. I can introspect and I can see that image of my house. But Russell says that can't be the memory. Why not? It seems like it should be the memory. Russell says it can't. He gives several arguments. I'm going to tell you one of his arguments. If this is not the argument you focused on, that's okay. He gives several different arguments. I'm going to tell you the hardest argument he gives. So it's completely fine if you focus on a different argument. He gives several arguments, actually. So that's okay. So don't, as I say in English, don't panic. Don't get really upset and think, oh, I didn't discuss that. He gives several arguments. Maybe you discussed another one he gives. That's okay. But his trickiest argument is this. Russell says, well, when you remember the past, the image you have is in the present. But the thing you are remembering is in the past. And remember that sentence that I erased, that I had on the board? Russell said, in order to understand any proposition, you have to be acquainted with the things that make the proposition up. If I understand the proposition, I remember the house I was raised in. And what I'm remembering is in the past. My memory has to be a relationship of my mind, an acquaintance of my mind with something that is earlier in time. Let me phrase that again. So, I have right now, let's draw a timeline. Let this be 1962, which is when I was born. Let this be 2020, which is a few years from now. Let this be 2014. Here in a classroom in Wuhan, China, I am having a mental image of the house I was born in. That's a memory of a house I last saw in 1981. The house in 1981 is in the past. I understand the sentence, and you understand the sentence. Van Norden remembers the house he saw in 1981. How do you understand that sentence unless your minds are acquainted with the past? Russell says any proposition you understand has to be built out of pieces you're acquainted with, out of parts you're acquainted with. Your mind must somehow be directly acquainted with the past. Your mind now has to be acquainted with the past in order for you to understand what claims about the past mean. If you weren't acquainted with the past, you couldn't understand a sentence about the past. So I'm not only acquainted with the sense data of this bottle now, which you might say, okay, that's not too weird. I'll give you that. I'm acquainted with the sense data of that bottle. You're acquainted with things which existed in the past. Not images you have of them now. You're acquainted with things that exist earlier in time. And Russell says, that might sound weird, but if that were not true, you could not understand a proposition about the past. Why? Every proposition you understand has to be based on things you are directly acquainted with. That is the weirdest argument Russell gives for this. If you didn't discuss that, that's okay, because that's the weirdest argument he gives. But it's also, in some ways, the one that I think might be right. I don't know how it could be right, but it's an interesting argument. Because how do you understand what it means to be past? And Russell says the only way you could understand what it means for something to be in the past would be if you're acquainted with the past. And you can't say, oh, but I was acquainted with it in 1981 as present. Yes, we know you're acquainted with the present. We know you're acquainted with now. But that doesn't explain how you understand anything about the past. When you say something happened yesterday, how do you understand that? Russell says you understand it because your mind is directly acquainted with the past. So, something to think about. If you want to ask about that more in office hours or something, we can talk about it. And again, Russell gives several different arguments, and there are different ways to explain what Russell said. So if you focus on a different argument, that's okay. I just wanted to make you aware of that argument, which is also in the text. So Russell says we have immediate knowledge of general principles, truths of perception, and memory. We also have, I'm sorry, this word's not very clear. This word here is derivative. Let me explain it a bit more. Derivative. So, derivative knowledge is knowledge you have based on immediate truths you know. So you know, you have knowledge of truths because you have knowledge of things. And in terms of knowledge of truths, you have immediate truths. And because of immediate truths, you can have derivative truths. What's an example of a derivative truth? Well, for example, BVN, Bryan Van Norden, is in Wuhan. How do you know that? Well, you can see me. You can't actually see me. You can just see my body. But, we'll leave that aside for the moment. You can still get to me by a description. Van Norden is the entity that makes the body move around or something like that. So the BVN is in Wuhan. New York is not the same place as Wuhan. Van Norden is not both in Wuhan and not in Wuhan. How do I know that? Well, non-contradiction. Very good. We're going to have to play the game. It's good. So, and therefore, Van Norden is not in New York. So it's not a complex example, but in a way, we do think this way, right? So if somebody said, hey, I think I saw Bryan in Manhattan today. And somebody said, you did not see Bryan in Manhattan. It seemed like it was Bryan. It looked like Bryan. I said, no, it can't be Bryan. He's teaching in Wuhan. That's a good argument because even though we don't say it, we think, well, if Bryan is in Wuhan, since New York is not the same place as Wuhan, and Van Norden's not both in Wuhan and not in Wuhan, we know Van Norden's is not in New York. This is derivative knowledge. So you know, as a general principle, Van Norden is not both in Wuhan and not in Wuhan. Law of non-contradiction. You know BVN is in Wuhan. Why? You can see it. Technically speaking, no, but you can replace BVN with a description of it based on what you can see. New York is not the same place as Wuhan, partially based on what your directives or partially based on description. If you haven't visited New York, you know it by description. But part of the description you know is that it's not in China. So you know Wuhan is not the same thing as New York. So this last thing, Van Norden is not in New York, that's an example of derivative knowledge for Russell. Now, now we have this. Now this might be kind of challenging. This is really complicated, I know. But on the other hand, there's something kind of beautiful about this. If you like math especially, or you like physics, or you like natural science, there's something beautiful. It's so tight, it's so neat. Everything fits into a nice little place. Everything has a precise definition. And so it's a very well organized, very well thought out, very appealing in a certain kind of way picture of knowledge. So it's very attractive in a certain way, even if we don't agree. The only last thing I want to make sure you understand from Russell's explanation is his account of truth as correspondence with facts. And suppose we take a sentence like, how did I write it? Oh, wow, I started with mouse it up. I see that. Was taller than Deng Xiaoping. According to Russell, lay it out for me now. What makes this sentence true? We have all the pieces now in place. What corresponds to Mao Zedong? Some of you might have talked. So what corresponds to Mao Zedong according to name? I should be clear. When I say what corresponds to Mao Zedong, the name Mao Zedong. Let's start with that. The name Mao Zedong, how does that get us to a person? What's the connection between Mao Zedong, the name, and the person? Do it just like we did Marcus Aurelius Van Norden. I know you want to say it. You're thinking it. Just say it, yeah. So somebody, raise your hand. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, for description. They have one, what description do them now? Anyone they identify. Yeah, the person, the person who's on all the Chinese currency. Okay, there we go. So it could be something like, well, Mao Zedong, this part of the sentence refers to, and I'm just going to draw a stick figure, M by it, refers to Mao Zedong. How does it refer to Mao Zedong? According to Russell, it's because, well, the name Mao Zedong has a description that goes with it. What description? Any description that gets us to that person. You could have one, yours might be, well, he's the guy on all the Chinese currency. Mine might be something different. He was the leader of the Chinese communists in 1949, when the Jiefang, when they liberated the mainland. He was the Chinese leader who met Richard Nixon. That any of those would do to get us to that person. Deng Xiaoping, same thing. Any description that gets us to this actual individual, Deng Xiaoping, could be something like the guy. I didn't do that on purpose, but yeah. I didn't even know he was that much shorter than Mao until I asked, And then I asked, John, I'm not sure. I said, well, how should I do this example? And he said, why don't you be taller than, Mao taller than Deng. Yeah, but anyway, I didn't know that. But anyway, so it could be, I could tell Deng Xiaoping, he's the one who said that thing about cats. This may have what color they are, blah, blah, blah. Or he was the next leader after blah, blah, blah. Or, he was, restructuring the economy, whatever description you want to do, some description will get you from the name Deng Xiaoping. You could have one description, I could have another one. Russell says it doesn't make any difference as long as it gets you to the same person. So this gets you to that. What is taller than is a universal. And the statement, so what is taller than is a universal. So that corresponds to a universal, not a particular, a universal. Because this person could be taller than that person. This person could be taller than that person. I could be taller than that person, and that person could be taller than me. It's always the same relationship, just with different individuals. So Russell says, Mao Zedong was taller than Deng Xiaoping. Mao Zedong, by means of a description, refers to Mao. Deng Xiaoping, by means of a description, refers to Deng. What is taller than refers to a universal, and the statement Mao Zedong was taller than Deng Xiaoping is true if This individual is related to that individual by this relation in that order. Because taller than has a direction. If I'm taller than you, then you are not also taller than me. Not P and not P in the same sense at the same time. So some relationships are directional in only one direction, like taller than. If I'm taller than him, he cannot be taller than me. Other directions can go both ways. If I'm in love with her, she could also be in love with me, or not. Some relationships always go both ways. If I'm married to her, she's married to me. But that's the basic idea. Again, there's something really simple and beautiful about it. I mean, not simple like you don't have to think about it, but simple like when you see it, like, wow, that's really beautiful. It's all kind of tidy and nice, all the pieces kind of fit together nice. How are we doing on time? Okay. Now the next thing, that's the basic outline of Russell's view. The next thing I want to talk about is, well, this all looks really beautiful. Why might it all be wrong? I'd like it to be right. Because if it's right, it just gives this nice, wonderful, simple theory of knowledge. And so many philosophers, particularly in the English-speaking world, everything, their whole career is based around ideas. But in this course, we're looking at three major approaches. Modernism, postmodernism, and hermeneutics. Russell's is the modernist approach. He might be right. I'm not saying he has to be wrong. There are a lot of smart philosophers who think he's mostly right. But we also have to look at, well, what about smart philosophers who think he's wrong? So the next thing I want to look at is, well, what reason is there for thinking that Russell might be wrong? So I'm going to critique or criticize Russell now. I'm going to start with, I'm not going to number it the same way. I'll just number it so it's easy to follow my examples. Russell said we have intuitive, or he also says immediate knowledge of truth. And these are truths that are indubitable. They cannot be doubted. And these include truths of, for example, mathematics and truths of logic. And Russell's examples, like 2 + 2 = 4, or the law of non-contradiction, there's something plausible about the examples. But why have some people question whether we have intuitive knowledge of things like mathematics and logic? One example of a problem is non-Euclidean geometry. Euclid was this famous ancient Greek geometer. He wrote a book called The Elements, which was for a couple thousand years the standard textbook of geometry. And one of the basic principles of Euclid's Elements is what's called the parallel postulate. And the parallel postulate says this: suppose you have a line here, and you have a line here, and you have a third line that goes through both of the lines, and there's a 90-degree angle, line and this line. There's also a 90-degree angle in between this line and this line. In other words, if that's a little hard to understand, these two lines are parallel. They're parallel. The parallel postulate says if these lines are parallel, they'll never meet. They'll go on forever and never meet. Euclidean geometry, the geometry of Euclid, so not non-Euclidean geometry, but Euclidean geometry, the geometry of Euclid, is based on the parallel postulate that claimed that parallel lines never meet. For 2,000 years, geometers thought, yeah, that's got to be right. Yeah, parallel lines never meet. In addition, they said, the space we live in is Euclidean space. We live in space in which the parallel postulate is true. So, geometry is true. There's one geometry. It's the geometry of ordinary physical space, and that geometry obeys the parallel postulate, which is part of Euclid's geometry. So it's Euclidean geometry. In the 19th century, two mathematicians discovered two different versions of non-Euclidean geometry. One of those non-Euclidean geometries said that parallel lines meet once. One of those geometries said parallel lines meet twice. Now we had one geometry for 2,000 years. Every smart person learned geometry. Every smart person knew the parallel postulate. Every smart person said there's one geometry. It's the geometry in which the parallel postulate is true. 19th century, two mathematicians say, let's try violating it. And they come up with not one, but two alternatives to Euclidean geometry. So now there are three geometries, Euclidean and two kinds of non-Euclidean geometry. It gets worse. Then in the 20th century, there was this German patent clerk. This clerk who worked in an office in Germany. And he was trying in the evening to write physics articles. And eventually he got a couple of the articles published, and people kind of liked those articles. And those articles were on special relativity and general relativity. That patent clerk was Albert Einstein. There's a sculpture of Einstein on campus, isn't there? Did I see one on campus, or did I totally hallucinate that? I thought I did. I thought I saw I got lost on campus, and I was like, that looks like Einstein. There is one, right? Yeah, you see it. Okay.
This is the two over in the library.
Okay, good. Okay, good. I was scared there for a second. I thought, wow, I'm really losing it. Okay. So Einstein said, you know what? Those non-Euclidean geometries, they describe the space we're in. This space is not Euclidean. Parallel lines meet in the space we're in. What that means is, if you got in a spaceship and you drove in a straight line for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, you'd come back to the Earth. Not because you turned around, because that's what our space is like. Our space is bent. So, Russell says, well, we have these general principles, like principles of mathematics, that you cannot doubt. For 2,000 years, nobody doubted that Euclidean geometry was the only geometry, and that it was the geometry of actual physical space. In the 19th century, we learned that there are two non-Euclidean geometries, and in the 20th century, we learned that one of those geometries describes the space we actually live in. We'll take a break, and then we'll talk about why Russell might also be wrong about logic. So, 我们休息一下。 Okay, good question. Yeah. So Russell will say, that in the world, Deng Xiaoping and Mao are still related by affiliation. And a sentence about that relationship would still be true if it said that Mao was taller than Deng. But it could be the case that someone doesn't know that sentence is true. Especially, there are many people in the U.S. who don't know who Deng Xiaoping is, because people are often ignorant about other in the U.S., especially very ignorant of Chinese politics. So if you ask them, or actually I didn't know who was taller, so if you ask me, who's taller, Mao or Deng? Before a few weeks ago, I was saying, I don't know. So it's still true, Russell would say, that Mao is taller than Deng. But Van Norden didn't know it before. And even if nobody knew it, there would still be a fact in the world that Mao is taller than Deng.
Right, it's true.
It's a fact in the world. Exactly, yeah. That's how Russell would.
The second one is that about the house.
Yes.
About the roof.
Yeah.
So I couldn't help feeling the suddenly the house with your own sound.
Right.
But we take islands for that reason. Sometimes from this, the action that we encounter choose the force of not given. So for example, the official is one example, your house, your home, doesn't still have to rest it doesn't have a rest anymore, So,
Yeah.
I need to help you with something from your thing.
Yeah. So, and Russell doesn't say very much about how to get derivative knowledge. He mentions deduction, which is the case like where I said, well, Van Norden's in Wuhan, so we know he's not in Wuhan. So that's a really simple case, right? And in chapter 6, he talks about induction, which are cases where we say, well, so far, you always see A and B go together. So we think A and B will go together in the future. But in complex cases like, well, Van Norden remembers that his house had red roof, but what is it now? And so that is, Russell doesn't give us any advice about how to deal with that kind of case. Yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah. Well, I mean, then usually, as a matter of ground, not philosophy, usually if you say your opinion that it's still true. So if I said, I think it still has a red roof, I'd say, I have a memory of my house which has a red roof. If you're in doubt, you think it might have changed, you say, yes, I have a red roof. Sure. So we've seen that there are some cases in mathematics, particularly the discovery of non-Euclidean geometry, which create something of a problem for Russell, because Russell wants to say that mathematical principles cannot be doubted, but in the case of Euclidean versus non-Euclidean geometry, we have a case where brilliant minds for a couple thousand years did not doubt that the parallel postulate was true, but it turned out it's not that it's false, it's just that it's optional. You can accept the parallel postulate and then you get Euclidean geometry. Or you can reject it, and you can reject it in two ways and get two different kinds of non-Euclidean geometry. And even after people discovered non-Euclidean geometry, they said, well, that's interesting, but after all, the space we're in, natural space, is Euclidean. But then Einstein said, no, it's not, actually. Real space is non-Euclidean. So that's a problem because Russell said part of what's distinctive about mathematical claims is you can't doubt them. Here's one that we should have doubted. Turns out if people had doubted it, they would have discovered this sooner problem. What about logic? We might say, well, logic, though, we're safe there, right? We know logic can't be doubted. This sentence is false. Which sentence? That sentence. Is that sentence true or false? You're laughing because you see the problem. If we say this sentence, which means this sentence, if we say, well, it's true, if it's true, well, then it's false. Because what the sentence says is that it is false. But if the sentence is false, then it's true. My daughter has a t-shirt that says, she has a version of this. It's a t-shirt. On one side it says, the sentence on the back of this t-shirt is false. And on the back it says, the sentence on the front of this t-shirt is true. These are all versions of the same paradox. Ironically, this is really funny, I think. Russell and his colleague, Alfred North Whitehead, wrote a major work in the philosophy of mathematics called Principia Mathematica. They tried to give a foundation for mathematics. Writing the book, they ran into a version of this. So their effort to give a foundation for mathematics ran into exactly this paradox. So this is sometimes called Russell's paradox. Now, why is that such a problem? It's a paradox, which is annoying. But why is it such a problem for Russell? Every statement, what about the law of the excluded middle? Either a statement should be true, or it should not be true. If this is true, it's not true. If it's not true, it's true. Then you say, oh, well, it's just a contradiction. There are no contradictions. Law of non-contradiction. Can't be both true and not true. So this sentence is false. It cannot be true. It cannot be not true. And it cannot be true and not true without violating logic. Now, interestingly, there are serious logicians. A logician is just somebody who studies logic. There are serious logicians who think that when they look at sentences like this, they say, this sentence is false, is true. And I talk to them and I say, well, but that doesn't make any sense because then it's false. And they say, yes, it's true and false. And I say, but that's a contradiction. And they say, yes, that's right, there are true contradictions. The law of non-contradiction is false. It's not a law. And they're not, the problem is, people who say this, logicians who say this, are not stupid, and they're not crazy. But if Russell is right, there are general principles of logic that any intelligent, non-crazy person recognizes are self-evident. You can't doubt them. There are people who doubt the law of non-contradiction. and they're not stupid, and they're not crazy. And they have reasons. Why is the reason? They say, well, obviously the law of non-contradiction is not true. Because you couldn't make sense of this sentence if the law of non-contradiction were true. Now, it could be the case that they're wrong, but even if they're wrong, that it shows the principle is not self-evident. The principle is not indubitable. They can doubt the principle. They can question it. So that's a problem for Russell as well. Now we might say, okay, well, all right, Ben, you're being really cute. You're being really, not like you were when you were a baby. You're being really clever. But surely these are weird, complex, abstract examples. When it comes to truths of perception, though, those are things that we know we can be sure of. You observe something and you know it's true. That you cannot doubt. That really is indubitable. Truths of perception, things you sense, you see, you hear, you touch, you taste, you smell. You cannot doubt those things. I have a lot of fun examples to show why that's a problem, Russell's claim. I'm going to use one, though, that I think will be especially, maybe you will especially enjoy this. I especially like this example. I meant to look up, can somebody help me out if you know this? How do you say supernova in Chinese? I can look it up. Is there a supernova? It's when a sun explodes. Do we know it? Does somebody have it? I can always look it up here. Yeah, I think I heard somebody say Chao Xin-Xin. Chao Xin-Xin. Did I say that right? Yeah. In English, we call that a supernova. Chao Xin-Xin. So it's when a star explodes, like a sun explodes. Now, some suns explode when they reach a certain age. Other ones just kind of burn out. Some of them become black holes. But some of them blow up in supernovas. Now, some supernovas are visible from the Earth. And let's hope one is visible in our lifetime, because they're really cool. They're not dangerous and they're really cool. Why do I say they're really cool? Or really, uncool? Because they appear like stars in the sky, but they're really bright. Sometimes they're as bright as the moon. And sometimes they last for 12 months, 2 years. Sometimes you can even see them during the daytime. Now, who knows? Oh, and there's some evidence that humans observed a supernova about 20,000 years ago. Because there are some cave drawings that look like they're drawings of a supernova. So they're drawings on the wall of some caves where there are dots that look like stars, and astronomers say, we know that constellation. And then there's this big thing next to the stars, and they say, we know a supernova happened about 10,000 years ago. This is a record of that. I think that's really cool. So that's awesome. But we're not sure. That's just a theory. What we are sure about, the earliest supernova, Charles Tintin. The earliest supernova, that's my word for the day. The earliest supernova we know of was recorded in China in the Han Dynasty in 185 of the Common Era. 185. So Eastern Han, 185. No evidence it was recorded in the West. None. Earliest recorded supernova recorded in China, 185. No evidence it was visible in China. This supernova was visible in the sky for 8 months. Nobody in the West noticed it. Now you might say, okay, anybody's entitled to one mistake. All right, Europe missed, a new star for 8 months. Okay, all right. 393 AD, another supernova, reported in China. In Europe, no report. 1054 AD, common era, common era. Boom. Another supernova, 1054. It was apparently 4 times as bright as Venus. And it was visible in the sky for 2 years. And nobody in Europe reported it. Now, are people in Europe, my ancestors, really, really stupid? Okay, sometimes, yeah. All right, fair enough. Okay, I'll give you that. Yeah. Sometimes we're very often stupid. Give you that. But not stupid all the time, right? How did people in Europe keep missing stars in the sky that were as bright as Venus and that were visible for months? It's a truth of perception. It's right there. People in Europe were very interested in astronomy. It's not as if they didn't care. They cared. Why couldn't they see it? Aristotle's theory of astronomy was the dominant theory in Europe for over 1,000 years. And according to Aristotle's theory, the only change that occurs beyond the moon is circular motion repeated infinitely. So Aristotle had a theory. Aristotle's theory was closer than the moon, things change all the time. Rains, lightning, seasons change, sometimes volcanoes erupt, the tide comes in, the tide goes out, all kinds of change. Empires rise, empires fall, people are live, born, die, all kinds of change. But he said, if you look at the stars and the planets, they don't seem to change except for circular motion. So his theory was, when you go beyond the moon, everything's fundamentally different from the Earth. Only change is circular motion repeated forever. So, according to Aristotle's theory, there can't be a supernova. That would be a change that was not just circular motion. What this suggests is people in Europe either didn't see the star because they didn't expect to see the star, or they saw it, but they didn't see it as a star. They saw it as something else. They said, look at that weird lightning, or look at that weird cloud, or look at that weird comet, or, hey, weird. But who cares? It's not like it's a star. But in China, they did not have this theory. So they looked at it and said, oh, it's clearly a star. What does it mean? And they recorded it. People in the West only started recording supernovas after when? Right the first time. After Copernicus. Copernicus is the astronomer who said that the sun is the center of the solar system and the earth goes around it. Aristotle said Earth is the center of the solar system. The sun and the planets go around the earth. Copernicus said, no, No, I think the sun's the center of the solar system. The Earth and the planets go around the sun. Once Copernicus questioned Aristotle's theory, all of a sudden Westerners start reporting supernovas. Tycho Brahe was an astronomer in the West in, I want to say Italy. He reported the supernova that occurred in 1572. So did Chinese astronomers. Johannes Kepler, another European astronomer, reported the supernova of 1604. So Chinese astronomers. So all of a sudden, after centuries of people in the West not noticing that there were these supernovas up there, while people in China are, that's very interesting. All of a sudden, Copernicus says, maybe Aristotle's wrong. And people are like, look at that, there's a star, a new star. How about that? When before, they had not seen a star. This is a problem for the notion that there are truths of perception that you cannot doubt. A little problematic. Because why couldn't they see a star that was visible for 2 years and right within how much time? When I think about what I want to talk about in the time we have left, there's a lot of interesting stuff. All right, so many interesting things. Well, let's take all these interesting things that come up with Russell, but let me just give you a couple issues. Okay, so we talked about how Russell said, I can use a name like Deng Xiaoping as a just better. Just better because it's more famous in the West. A lot of Americans have heard of Deng Xiaoping. Most smart Americans have heard of Deng Xiaoping, but almost all Americans have heard of Mao Zedong. A lot of them have heard of Deng Xiaoping. So Russell says, well, the name Mao Zedong refers because you attach a description to it that gets you to the individual. A famous American philosopher who's still alive, named Saul Crittenden, he wrote a famous book called Naming and Necessity. And he questioned many things that Russell said. One of the things he questioned was, he said, and this is my example, but Kripke uses a similar example. Suppose I'm an American, and like many Americans, I'm very uninformed about other countries. Americans are very uninformed about other countries. And so if you ask me, says, hey, do you know who Mao Zedong was? I'm like, yeah, he was the first president of the Republic of China. 中华民国的第一个总统. Yeah, you see the problem, right? So suppose you ask me, do I know who Mao Zedong was? I'm American, like, yeah, he was, I studied him in school. He's the first president of the Republic of China. That's not that, there are Americans who would say that, believe me, right? And the fact that they can even name the Republic of China or the People's Republic, most Americans get those confused. Most Americans, honestly, they don't know which is which. I'm sorry, but Americans are bad at history and politics. I'm sorry. One is why you're a better country. Yes, Mao Zedong. So when I use the name Mao Zedong, who am I referring to? It seems like when I use the name Mao Zedong, I'm referring to Sun Zhongshan, right? Now that's weird, isn't it? But then what if I say, died in 1976. Is that true or not? Well, yeah, but when I say it, because I'm stupid and I think Mao Zedong was the first president of the Republic of China, on Russell's theory, I'm referring to Sun Zhongshan. It seems like I'm referring to Sun Zhongshan. So Sun Zhongshan didn't die in 1976. So we should say that when Van Norden, because he's stupid and thinks that Mao Zedong was the first president of the Republic of China, says Mao Zedong died in 1976, he's wrong. Because Sun Zhongshan didn't die in 1976. So Kripke said Russell's theory about names has to be wrong. When you use a name, it doesn't refer by means of a description you have, because your description might be wrong, or it might not pick out anybody. When you use a name, Kripke said, the use of the name, and I'm simplifying here, just read the book if you're curious, but he said the use of the name is determined by the community. At some point, Mao Zedong was named Mao Zedong. And then the community said, let's all use this name to refer to that person. And so when I utter the name Mao Zedong, I'm trying to use the name the same way everybody else does. It doesn't make any difference whether my description is right or wrong. Kripke says the name Mao Zedong directly refers to Mao Zedong without any description. Description does nothing. Description is not relevant to the reference. Read the book if you want to hear more details. What about, Russell has this theory about how to analyze the statement. Right here. Mao Zedong was taller than Deng Xiaoping. What about this statement? Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would not have fought World War II. This is not my area of specialization. I actually think it's true. My father fought in World War II. He was in the Navy in World War II, and I asked him, what did people think about the war? And he said, until Pearl Harbor, we thought, this is not our problem. It's Europe's problem and it's China's problem. It's not our problem. Most Americans did not want to fight. But then Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and it's just, oh no, it's on now. Right? That's a slang expression in English. It means, oh, we're going, we're fighting now. So that really upset people, and all of a sudden everybody wanted to fight. So bad historical move. I have a whole lecture about World War II. It's really interesting. Anyway, Japan made a terrible tactical, strategic miscalculation. That was just a bad move. The U.S. would have stayed out. But whether I'm right or wrong doesn't make any difference. The point is we understand this statement, and we can argue about it. How does this work on Russell's theory? It doesn't describe what actually happened in the world. What actually happened was Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The U.S. entered the war. It says, if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, then the U.S. would not have entered. What does that correspond to on Russell's view? What fact does it correspond to? And there's a famous U.S. philosopher, it's a different one, this is not, named David Lewis. He's written he passed away about 10 years ago. He's got a book, I think I have the title right. Doing this by memory. I'm directly acquainted. David Lewis on the plurality of worlds. And here's what Lewis said. Lewis said, look, if you take a statement like, if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would not have fought in World War II. He says, there are an infinite number of possible worlds. And by worlds, I do not mean planets. I mean like whole universes. And Lewis said there are an infinite number of separate universes. So when you say, if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would not have fought in World War II, what you are saying is that in the universes in which Japan does not attack Pearl Harbor, in those universes, the U.S. does not enter World War II. Why? And he thinks that these worlds actually exist. There are there are infinitely many possible worlds, separate from our own. Why does he think that? He's trying to find a way for statements like this to correspond to facts. This statement, if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would not have fought in World War II, doesn't correspond to any fact in this world. Because the fact in this world is Japan did attack Pearl Harbor and the U.S. didn't. So Lewis said, this corresponds to the fact that in other possible worlds in which Japan doesn't attack Pearl Harbor, the U.S. does not enter World War II. That seems like a crazy theory, but Lewis goes to that theory because he said, this shows you what this corresponds to. This is the fact that this corresponds to. So many interesting things. All right, one last thing. Yeah, wait, one last thing. One thing we haven't had too much time to talk about is derivative knowledge. I gave you an example, which is I said, well, look, if you know Van Norden's in Wuhan, since you know that Wuhan is in New York, you know that Van Norden's not in New York. That's a simple example. Let me give you a more complex example. If I start talking too fast, you can raise your hand or something to let me know. When I get excited about philosophy, I start talking faster. So I'm trying to talk slowly to make it easier, but sometimes I get excited because I like philosophy. So, but you can let me know if I'm doing that. That's okay. That's not impolite. That's helping me. So, to the best explanation. And here's an example. The sun appears to rise. That's true, right? In the morning you get up, you look out, the sun appears to rise. If the earth rotates around its axis, so if the earth spins like a top around its axis while going around the sun will appear to rise. The sun appears to rise. If the sun revolves around the earth, the sun will appear to rise. Both of these arguments explain why the sun appears to rise. The conclusion of this argument is that the sun revolves around the earth. The conclusion of this argument is that the earth rotates around its axis. The question is, which is the best explanation? When Copernicus, so this theory is the view of Copernicus, this is the view of Aristotle. When Copernicus first proposed his theory, people said the best explanation is still this one. Why? They said, if the earth is spinning on its axis, if we're spinning like a top, let me ask you this. Do you feel like you're spinning on a top? No. And if Copernicus is right, you're not just spinning like a top. You're spinning like a top on a track that's zooming around the sun. So you're not only spinning like a top, you're also zooming around the sun at the same time. Where's the wind? Where are the hurricane-sized winds? Why aren't we knocked off our feet by all the motion? Why don't the clouds zoom through the skies? Why aren't trees uprooted by all the motion? It'd be like on a roller coaster or a ride that was scary or an out-of-control car. Why doesn't it feel like it? So people said, this is a clever theory, but it's not the best explanation because it feels like we're not moving. So this is a better explanation. Also, the Bible makes repeated reference to the sun rising, the sun setting. There's also a famous passage where it says that God stopped the sun in the sky so that the Israelites could finish a battle. And so, if you're living in Europe in the early modern era, where the Catholic Church is dominant, they say, well, the Bible says the sun moves through the sky, doesn't feel like we're moving. This is kind of a crazy theory for a lot of good reasons. It's not the best explanation. Copernicus' theory that the sun's the center and the earth goes around it. This is actually a better theory. Next week, and read, you don't want to read this, do what you did this week. Look at the syllabus on the QQ site. It'll tell you what to read. If you have questions about what to read, you can ask on the QQ group, but there's basically, I'm going to have you read a selection from Thomas Kuhn's, the preface to one of his work. I'm going to have you read some notes I wrote to make the Kuhn easier to understand, and I'm going to have you read a chapter from Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and I'm going to have you write another brief essay. And the brief essay is all like this week. The readings are on the website. The syllabus, the 教学大纲, is on the QQ Twin. So you find the readings, 材料, the 必读材料 is on the QQ Twin, and the 教学大纲 So, but what Food's going to be talking about is issues like this. As science develops, when people argue about what's the best explanation, what factors do they take into account? What makes something the best explanation? And the thing is, at different points in history, different explanations may seem to be the best. At a certain point in history, the fact that an explanation fits the Bible may make it the best explanation. At another point in history, the fact that an explanation fits the Bible may be a bad reason for accepting it. It depends. So, something else. Thank you for your attention. We're about out of time, so just you know,